Welcome to this video for LIS 634 History of Children's Literature. I am Lisa Reynolds. I am the instructor for this course. I will not be doing a video every single week. However, because we had issues last night with recording, I will go ahead and record this week's lesson. On the agenda today, we will be covering the syllabus and important dates, and then also I will be going into a lecture on the oral beginnings of storytelling and how that impacted children's literature. I'm going to go ahead and start by introducing myself. As I mentioned, my name is Lisa Reynolds. I am currently living in Doha, Qatar. I work in a small branch campus for the University of Aberdeen, which is based in Scotland, but they have a branch campus here in Qatar. I have been here for 13 years. Before I worked with the University of Aberdeen, I moved here to Qatar to work at the Qatar National Library to help that open, where I worked in public services. I worked a lot with policy development and also collection development, including the collection development for the children's department. This is the first class that I am teaching with USM, so I am very excited about it, and I'm hoping that this can be a collaborative experience where we can learn things together. I'm going to go ahead and jump straight into the syllabus. It is on your Canvas page, so I would recommend actually going and looking at it more thoroughly. I'm just sort of going to highlight some of the things that I think are important. You can see here's the add drop dates for the class. Because this is a summer course, things happen quite quickly. I'm hoping that you don't withdraw from this class, but if you do, you can see the dates here. It has to pretty much be done within the first week. Here is the course description and objectives. This is the history of children's literature, as I mentioned. It traces the development of children's literature in England and the United States, so mostly English speaking, to the earliest 20th century. You can see here the list of objectives for this course. Hopefully by the end you will have done these things. Also, course expectations, you are expected to check your USM email daily, and also to check Canvas, to complete assignments, and also to read and post on the discussion boards. There is no required textbook for this course. There will be selected readings, mostly through the library at USM, so please be sure to check Canvas on what you should be reading for the week-by-week breakdown. Now let's go ahead and look at our assignments. You can go ahead and see that the first couple assignments will be for the end of this week. Hopefully most of you have already done the AI policy, plagiarism policy, and contact information. Also, there is a discussion topic to introduce yourself. I have seen that several of you have already posted on that. And then you can also read and respond to the first set of readings, and that will all be due Friday. The first big assignment is due July 12th. And that is the assignment for Fables. We will sort of discuss that at the end of the class today. One thing that I will point out for those of you that were on the session last night, on the original syllabus, the Read and Respond 2 and the Read and Respond 3 were due on the same dates. Some people were asking about that last night, so we went ahead and changed the due date so that the Read and Response 2 is still due on that Friday the 19th, but the Read and Response 3 will be due on June 23rd. So that is one update that I want to point out. Just want to go over some of the late policies. It is really important that you meet the deadlines. There is a 24-hour grace period, but after that, materials points will be taken off. So please just try to do things on time. I know it's summer and things are happening very quickly, but hopefully you will be able to keep up because it could impact your grade. Also, the best way to reach me is via email. Hopefully it will not take 48 hours. I've given myself 48 hours. Hopefully I will be able to respond within 24 hours, especially during the weekdays. The weekends, that might be a little bit different. But email me on my email that you see here. I'm not necessarily going to be looking at Canvas email all the time, so I do recommend that you email me via the USM email. It is policy that all of the communication needs to be through university communications. So if you want to CC your personal email, that's fine, but please be sure that it is coming from your USM email. All right? Throughout the course, we will have discussion boards. As I mentioned, the first read and response will be due at the end of this week. It is important that you post on the discussion boards twice, or at least twice. You can post more than that if you would like, but you need to put your original post and then also respond to one of your classmates. So that's really important. And one of the things that I do want to point out is if you can put up your post perhaps a day before or earlier than the due date, because that gives people time to respond and there can be more of a discussion. So please try not to put your post up right at the end, because then there can't be any discussion. And the whole entire point of those boards is to create a discussion. So be aware of that, and also give the opportunity for your classmates to post and respond to what you've said, because what you've said is probably interesting. This section is from the student engagement policy on the syllabus, and I just want to at this moment mention that because this is a children's lit course, I don't expect there to be very many controversies. I just want to be sure that we're all respecting each other and understand that we all have opinions and that we should be able to listen to them. One of the things that I really love about librarians is that we're passionate people. But I want to be sure that when we're in this class setting that we respect other people's passions as well, and that we are respectful of everyone's opinion. This is the portion about academic integrity. I went kind of on a tangent last night during this portion. I am very interested in referencing and citations. It's actually one of the things that I am researching in my PhD is about how international students interact with referencing and citations and how that has to do with authority. So I want to be sure that you guys are practicing proper APA citations. I am not going to, fail someone because they did an improper APA citation, but I just want you guys to practice, because I do think that it's a skill that we as librarians need to be working on. And so just be aware that I would like you, as you're going through your assignments, to use APA citations. I did say last night that if you are more comfortable with MLA, you can use MLA, just please be consistent. But I just want everybody to know that this is something that I'm interested in and that I will be paying attention. I'm not necessarily going to be marking people down for it, but I will probably correct you, and I just want you guys to be conscious of that. And I wanted to give everybody sort of a warning that this is something that is important to me going forward. All right, now I'm going to sort of leave the syllabus portion. There's a lot more stuff in there, but these were the things that I just thought were important. So I want to be sure to cover those, but I recommend going into Canvas and actually looking at the document because there might be some more information that will be helpful. And as always, you can email me to ask any specific questions. But now we're going to go into the oral story portion of this lecture. Before we get started, I want everybody just to take a minute and think about your favorite book from childhood. What did you like about it? Take time to maybe research what the copyright date was. Was it a historical or was it new? Do you think it's still popular right now? Last night I used the example of the true story of the Three Little Pigs, which came out in 1989, which was when I was a child, and it was sort of a new take where it told a story from the villain's point of view, which right now, given the time, doesn't seem as revolutionary, but in 1989 it was a new way to look at it. And while I still think that the book is popular, it's obviously not as popular as it was when I was a child, because again, I sort of think that that way of storytelling isn't as unusual as it was in 1989. So if you want to stop this video and think about it, or just kind of as you go through your head, just think about a favorite book and just think about how the progression of it has been throughout your lifetime. Like, is it still popular? Is it not still popular? So what is children's literature? It's literature generally written for, about, or enjoyed by children. However, today, because we're looking at oral stories and oral traditions, it's important to remember that some of these things, or most of the things that we will be looking at today, were not written specifically for children. They were shared with children, but they actually were for people of all ages. And even though this is not a psychology class, it is important to keep in mind that the definitions of childhood have changed throughout history. Even in some of our lifetimes, the idea about childhood has changed. So if you go back 50 years, if you go back 100 years, if you go back 200 years, how people viewed children and childhood were very, very different. And that oftentimes a lot of the things that we're going to be talking about today were not originally geared towards children. It was geared towards the whole entire community. So just be aware of that. But oftentimes these oral traditions, their purpose was to teach, to entertain, and to preserve culture. So that is really, really important. And that often what happens is we have these traditions, these oral traditions that were originally for everyone, but again, as we've moved through history and the ideas of childhood have changed, these stories have now become more children's stories, or they've sort of split, and there's certain adult-themed stories and there's the children-themed stories. So that's something to really think about. The functions of oral stories. So we've got to think about people sitting around the campfire. They didn't have TVs, they didn't have radios, they certainly didn't have Netflix. This was the original way that people entertained themselves, by telling stories to each other, telling fantastical stories. But not only was it a way to entertain, but it also was a way to educate. These stories build character. I'm going to sound like a broken record today, but we're going to talk a lot about how these stories imposed, the morals of the time into the people that were listening. So these are the way that people learned. A lot of, there wasn't formal education. So people had to learn life skills in certain ways, and a lot of the time that was through stories. It's also about cultural preservation. So how do you be sure that future generations will remember what happens what happened before? Well, it's by telling stories. Sometimes these stories get embellished, but it is also about telling people about their history and their beliefs. And again, I'm going to say it a lot, but it's for moral instruction. It's telling people what are good examples and what are bad examples. You know, what are the consequences for doing good? What are the consequences for doing poorly? So as people sat around the campfire, the whole entire point of oral traditions were to explain things. So it was to explain the origins of the humans. It was to explain the origins of the universe. Things that not necessarily people had answers to, but they wanted to understand what was going on around them. And these stories really helped people understand things that to them were unknowable. And that's really one of the great things about stories, is that it's something that everyone can relate to. And again, I want everyone sort of, people were sitting in their families, in their tribes, and they were telling stories. And that's how these were transmitted. But even though now we have books, we have movies, we still are telling stories. And maybe on a smaller scale. Every family has stories they like to tell, whether it's how your parents met, or how you met your spouse, or a funny thing that happened on a vacation. These are stories that still have so these are proving that we still have an oral tradition. We're still telling stories orally. It's just not as formalized as it used to be. Today we're going to look over 4 different types of oral stories. We're going to look at myths, and myths were generally, there to explain natural phenomena or the origins of people. Oftentimes these stories, they were the equivalent of Bible stories for a lot of cultures in the past. We're also going to look at legends. And these are usually things that are based on historical fact, but have been embellished. They usually involve historic figures, doing something to save the day. We will go into folk tales, which are basically community-based adventures, again, generally with a moral. And then also fables, which are short tales with explicit lessons. And that's actually going to be the basis for your first assignment. I will stress, most of these stories were children listening along adults. They were usually simple because they needed to be remembered. This was a time before literacy was widespread, so the storytellers had to remember the stories, and then people that wanted to tell the story again to other people needed to remember them. So the stories needed to be simple. So the first oral tradition that we're going to look at today is myths. And throughout the course today, I'm going to have you look at some videos. On the next slide, you will be able to watch a video. Most of the videos that we will see today will be geared towards children, except for this first, which is the trailer for the new Christopher Nolan movie, The Odyssey, and which might seem like an odd choice. But this sort of goes back to, I think it's important to remember that these stories were originally for all audiences. And so whether for children or for adults, and also our ideas about childhood have changed. So I don't think that in ancient Greece, the mother of a 10-year-old child was too worried about her son going to hear somebody recite Homer's poem, The Odyssey, because of the violence. And I think that it's really important to also show that these stories continue to have impact. And one of the really great things about stories, especially these historical oral traditions, is how malleable they are. Because there's not really a set written story, oftentimes it can move forward into modern time and have a modern take that is important. So you can go to the next slide and watch the video, and then we will discuss after. Well, as I mentioned, a lot of these famous myths were actually stories about gods and goddesses. And these were like the Bible stories for these ancient civilizations. And there's often, this is an early link between literature and education. And this is how, these cultures passed down what they viewed as important, and they told them in these stories format so that people would remember them. Because again, there was not, most people were illiterate and could not read and write. So there was not a way to easily distribute these stories. It had to be done via storytelling. The next oral tradition that we're going to look at is legends. Legends are usually timeless narratives that blend historical figures with myth. It's passed down through generations. So usually they are based on actual people or events, but they have been embellished usually to more heroic standards as the passing has gone along. We're going to watch a story time about Robin Hood on the next slide. So we'll go ahead and move to the video. One of the reasons why so many of the stories that we are talking about today have resonated throughout history is that they can change and adapt with the times. We sort of discussed that a minute ago with the Odyssey. But because these stories are not necessarily written, they can be changed and made to adapt to whatever situation is important to the culture at the time, or even to what the storyteller thinks is important. One of the things I really noticed when I watched that Robin Hood story is that it comes out quite harsh about taxes, which sort of I was surprised about in a child's fairy tale story. But there's also a way that you can tell the Robin Hood story that's much more socialist about, the rich class hoarding money and stealing from them to distribute it to the poor. So really, this story could be told lots of different ways. The outline might be the same, but the details can be different to say what the storyteller wants it to mean. And I do think that that's one of the reasons why these stories are so timeless. Because necessarily, the broader picture can be told throughout time, but the specific details can be tied to what is happening when the story is actually being told. I think that's really interesting. Here you can see a list of sort of famous legends, and as we discussed earlier, a lot of these lists are probably based on some sort of historical place or event or person, but they've been embellished over time. We're now going to move on to folktales, but before we actually talk about folktales, I want to discuss the difference between folktales and folklore. Folklore is much bigger than folktales. What I like to say is that all folktales are folklore, but not all folklore is folktales. So the folklore is more about cultural DNA. It includes the art, stories, knowledge, and practices of people. Folklore can be bound up in memory and histories. Folklore is one of the many ways we communicate who we are, often, but certainly not always, rooted in the past. So like I said, this is more about how cultures think about themselves and how they pass that sort of information on to future generations. Folktales are just traditional fictional stories passed down through generations. Primarily spoken, but they reflect the culture and values of the folk, which oftentimes refers to common people. So folk tales are generally spoken tales. There's no known authors. They usually have universal themes that are morality based. And again, so many of the stories that we're talking about today are a way to convey morals to both adults and children. And then also they generally use simple language. And that's why I think that they have been used so much in children's literature, even if they haven't always started out as children's literature. But they had to use simple language, again, because prior to the printing press, most people were illiterate, and stories had to be easy to remember and easy to retell. So that's one of the reasons why oftentimes these stories are very simple. So we're going to go ahead in the next video, and the next video that we're going to watch is Goldilocks and the Three Bears. Here is a list of famous folktales, and I think when people are talking about historical children's literature, oftentimes they are talking about folktales. Most people are familiar with the Brothers Grimm books, but also many of the adaptations done by Disney and other adaptations throughout the years. These folktales are really ones that have firmly been established as children's literature, that are written for children. And there have been several interpretations throughout history. I even talked about one earlier with the true story of the Three Little Pigs. They're very malleable and they're able to shift and change, but I really do think that oftentimes folktales are something that is very associated with children's literature. We're now going to move on to fables. And fables is actually going to be what you are going to be working with for your first assignment. But first, we're going to go ahead and watch a video on the next screen. Fables are generally short stories that feature animals, legendary creatures, plants, and inanimate objects that have been anthropomorphized, which means to give human traits to non-humans. They have a moral lesson. Probably the most famous author of fables is Aesop, and Aesop's fables will be what you are going to be using for your first assignment. So let's go ahead and go to talking about the upcoming assignments. There's 2 small assignments this week. First, hopefully most of you have done it or are about to post an introduction of yourself. And then also, you need to post a 5-sentence summary and a 10-sentence reflection of one of the articles that you were supposed to read this week. For both of those posts, please be sure that you also respond to at least one of your classmates' posts. You can respond to more than one, but to complete the assignment, you at least need to post to one other. Also, the first assignment is coming up. You will be choosing from a list of Aesop fables, which if you click on the word fables on this slide, it will take you to the list. And from there, you will choose one of the fables to either rewrite and to modernize it, to compare 2 of the fables with similar themes. You can also find a picture book of the fable from the list and do a deep dive into what the illustrations add to the bare bones of the fable. You can illustrate or expand your selected fable. You can create a video or animation of the fable, or you can create a video of you and volunteers acting out the fable. You only have to pick one of those. Somebody asked yesterday, the fables are quite short, So if you decide to rewrite the selected fable, it can just be one page. I don't expect you to write a 5-page fable based on a 1-page original. If you have any questions about the assignments, please feel free to email me. I am trying to reply to most of your introduction posts. That is not something that I will do normally on your read and responses, but because it is the introduction, I wanted just to get to know you and for you to get to know me. Please keep in contact, and I'm hoping that this video was helpful for those that couldn't attend the course or had connection issues. Thank you.